Hey guys, I'm Dr. Kim Sage. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. This video is all about borderline personality disorder and really why we have it. Where does it come from? I think the truth is that it's hard to have borderline PD and it's hard to be on the receiving end with a person who has it. And so I thought I would just sort of explain to you what the research says about where this disorder comes from. Not only so we can have honestly compassion for people that have it, but also because even though I know it feels like labeling, when you're a person who has received this behavior as a child, remember, children have no control. When there's a name for it, and it's not just emotional abuse, because frankly, emotional abuse just feels so vast and wide. When patients sit with me and they understand that in terms of receiving this behavior as a child, oh, there's a meaning behind this. There's a cluster of behaviors that explain this. It really helps them separate the wound from the person inflicting the wound. It helps them say, this isn't my fault because this is actually something that was painful and wrong for my caregiver. It doesn't make it okay, because at the end of the day, I honestly really struggle with how do we balance the fact that we come from certain childhoods and certain genetic backgrounds and certain things that make us a certain way up against, yes, but we're still responsible for our behavior. And I also want to say to those of you who have this disorder that you have to also remember that if you are in treatment, that is just phenomenal. But treatment is also difficult. And also, historically speaking, especially in a certain generation of women, there wasn't DBT. There hasn't been exposed and obvious treatments. And DBT is a very intense treatment. There are other treatments as well. But it's important to know that when you are on the receiving end of this, it's painful. When you are on the end of this where you're the one with this disorder, it's painful. But I just thought I would go through sort of what the research says, especially from an attachment perspective, because I really do believe that the majority of the personality disorders outside of genetic predisposition and heredity and things like that, it is that nature versus nurture. There really is a certain type of environment that tends to lend itself in terms of attachment to creating these wounds, to creating these types of disorders. So if you're a child of a borderline PD and you have borderline PD, you're on the one end in the victim, and it is a victim as a child. You are on the victim end of the receiving of it, and you also can be on the inflicting end. And so you really are walking the line between understanding and living through both. And that's a hard place to be. So I thought it would just be helpful to just talk about it in terms of what the research says. We'll quickly talk about sort of the genetic and the brain research, and then really just go into what do we know about attachment and borderline PD in terms of the childhoods of people that tend to have this cluster of symptoms that create borderline PD. So much like the dilemma of the attachment style, which we call disorganized, which is the impossible dilemma, with the source of safety is also the source of fear. I think that really applies to understanding this attachment style in general. It's a dilemma. It's a dilemma when you've been on the receiving end and when you're on the inflicting end. It's a dilemma even if you just didn't have a childhood like this, because not all the research says that you had to have a certain type of childhood, although we do know, like I said, that certain childhoods really do create oftentimes a cluster of symptoms. It's important to know that not all families look the same, and there are things like temperament and personality. If you've had more than one child, you probably know that kids come out of the womb with certain temperaments, and some are easier than others. And so if you came out of the womb with a more challenging temperament and your parent has less ability to take care of you and more emotional dysregulation and instability and all that, it's going to make it harder. Now, that in no way blames a child with a difficult temperament. It's just that this is the reality, that these toxic combinations sometimes are bad luck, whatever you want to call them. But it can also be true that if you have this, BPD as a disorder, you could have a very easy child, but your inability to navigate your own emotions and life make it difficult for that child. So this doesn't really matter what kind of kid you have. I just want to acknowledge that certain combinations can be more difficult. Now, what we know from the research is that we have a combination we all really believe in this sort of nature and nurture dynamic. The research tends to show that there is some heritability, meaning that if you have a first line human being in your family with this disorder, specifically a mother, but it is very much more likely you could have it, although it by no means says that you will have it if your parent has it. In fact, I think oftentimes when we have parents like this, we fight harder to be different and to choose different paths. Doesn't mean we don't have wounds and make our own mistakes, but there is no reason why that has to be the case. Although, to be fair, it is more likely. The research on people with BPD in terms of their brain development or their brains shows that for people that have BPD, there tends to be a problem with serotonin in their brains. And this is one of our neurotransmitters. Remember, these are the chemicals that help us send messages in our brain. And altered levels of serotonin are related to issues around depression, aggression, and difficulty controlling sort of instinctive urges and behaviors. And we also know that brain scans of people that have BPD reveal that 3 parts of the brain are smaller than people that do not have this disorder. And they are the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the orbitofrontal cortex. Now, just really quickly, the amygdala is really an emotion regulation center of our brain, where things like fear, aggression, and anxiety are navigated. The hippocampus helps regulate behavior and self-control, in addition to memory and other things. And the orbitofrontal cortex is involved in decision-making and planning. So if we're saying that the MRI scans and the brains of these individuals are smaller, it goes to show that this combination of emotionality and regulation of self and how we navigate sort of more difficult impulses, if those areas are compromised in the brain, they're going to have an impact in the way it plays out for a person with BPD. The development of these structures of the brain are also affected during childhood. They are being shaped and groomed and developed in terms of our experiences. And so there is this interrelation between what we experience and the way our brain processes and sort of shapes itself. At the core of the environmental argument, which is where we're going to really go now and talk about attachment, is that there was a highly invalidating environment. And I'm going to go into what that looks like. The research shows, obviously, that people who have experiences like physical, sexual, emotional abuse, substance abuse, right? More of those extreme environments, periods of absence and separation, foster care, all of those things that would really interfere with natural, healthy development and attachment are probably going to create a more likely diagnosis. Obviously, if anyone in your family had a serious mental health issue, all of these are going to interfere with attunement, which is what I've been talking about in these videos, which is this is our parents' ability to recognize our emotional state, meet our needs, provide a secure base for us to explore, and be a sort of safe haven and harbor for us as we mature. And so if our parent is compromised in these areas, it makes sense that we're going to have a lot of needs that don't get met. So at the hallmark of all of this, I think it's really important to know that for people who had a BPD parent or have one now, there's often a lot more trauma as a result. And I'm talking about everything from events like a suicide attempt to just complex PTSD, chronic trauma in terms of chaotic, unstable relationships. This is not about blaming, but this is about helping you understand. And this is really also why it's so important that you get treatment and help if you have this diagnosis, because it makes affect regulation and relational stability so difficult. And it's hard enough for you to do that yourself. But when you have a child who has no escape and no power, they are going to be receiving this. And so in the childhoods of those with this diagnosis, we know that they had, through the research now, I'm really going to go into the research, a combination of experiences where a parent or caregiver was frightening and frightened, right? So we had these extreme responses. And the root of it is the source of safety was also the source of fear. So as I keep saying, you can imagine what a dilemma that is. And so for the child of this, there is this hostile helplessness. On the one end, it's like you're supposed to be, helpful and saving me and protecting me, but you're also potentially hostile and dangerous and unsafe. And so a child has to try to figure out, is there a pattern to this? Now, some research actually believes that as opposed to there being disorganized, no pattern, that even within the disorganization, there is an organized pattern. But that creates this sort of chaotic cluster of really internal coping skills and working models that a child has to then adapt to or create for themselves to survive. And it really is about survival, especially in the more extreme environments. I'm going to read some of the research now as I look down on my computer because it's a lot for me to just memorize. But as I go through it, I want to just give you some of the hallmarks of what some of the research has really demonstrated. They found, as they went back and looked at their attachment profiles, they found a global devaluation of caregivers, identifying with a hostile caregiver. Imagine identifying with your hostile caregiver. A sense of feeling especially unworthy. Repeated references to fearful affect. So repeated references to being scared. Laughter at pain. References to controlling or punitive treatment towards them by their caregivers. And a ruptured attachment with a family member, meaning there was no real consistent healthy attachment. So the research showed that the women with PD, this is women specifically, manifested hostile, helpless states of mind. These women identified with fearful, anxious states of mind. So fearful and anxious, this is actually looking at being fearful, which is more disorganized, and the anxious attachment, significantly associated with having to provide caregiving to the caregiver. So taking care of mom, that's having to be the mom in early childhood, as the tendency to globally devalue the caregiver. So they sort of felt negative feelings towards the caregiver, but they also had to be the caregiver, and they were overly involved in the parent's state of mind, which I've mentioned is specifically found in anxious attachment styles and in disorganized. So this is where there's no boundaries between you and the parent. The parent is needing you to take care of them. They're oversharing about their life, their relationships, their sex life, their dating life. They have this really lack of a understanding about where a child begins and where they end. And so there's sort of this blurring of lines, and the child becomes their best friend. I've said it and I'll say it a million times. I don't think it's healthy to call your child your best friend. Now, when you become an adult, that's a different story, although it can still be a burden. But if your child wants to call you their best friend, that sort of is okay. I think that makes sense because you should be a safe place. And it depends on their own social lives. And some kids have a better, experience with friends than others. But when you're calling your child, and I'm talking about your child under the age of 18 specifically, your best friend, I know I'm probably going to get some heat for this, but I just don't think it's healthy because it's a lot of pressure to be a parent's best friend. They're supposed to be your friend, your parent, your safe harbor, not the other way around. And that is where I think we sometimes have this blending at times that gets to be a real burden for kids. Now, as a result of this, all of these behaviors and experiences begin to really affect our metacognition, our ability to think about ourselves and others, sort of see ourselves and others in terms of what they're thinking, what their expectations are, what the relationship expectations are. You're going to find that people that grow up this way with these type of BPD parents are going to have a harder time with their own sense of self-development, with their own thinking about thinking, because they didn't have a caregiver who was able to do that for them and model that for them and make it safe to sort of mirror back their own feelings. They're often trying to mirror back the parent, their feelings, and give them what they need. And that goes back to why I was saying it's a lot of responsibility and burden to be seen as a problem solver, a parent, a BFF, for an adult, especially when you're a child. This role reversal is actually very common in women who have been studied with BPD. Now, a little more of the research I'm just going to read to you I think is interesting. It found that the research concluded that parental relationships had certain dynamics, and this I thought was fascinating because I'm really coming at it from not so much a parenting but from an attachment perspective. But of course parenting feeds into that, right? We have these, they're all sort of connected. A parenting style is how we go about engaging in discipline and the rules and structures, but attachment to me goes even deeper. It's about what is the universal mission statement or law or rule about how we operate in a relationship together. And so it says this: one of the studies found that an actively rejecting father and an unloving and neglecting mother may be particular risk factors for the inability to resolve traumatic experiences. Now, I'm going to make some videos on, I do believe, narcissism. We all know that narcissism and BPD are very much overlapping. Personality disorders in general, I think it's fascinating to look at what kinds of attachment styles in childhood tend to create these. But if you think about, if you had an actively rejecting father and a mother who couldn't really mirror back to you, it would make any resolution of your own story or an experience, or even a trauma that maybe wasn't necessarily even related as much to the parents, but just a trauma in general, difficult to resolve. But it is traumatic itself to have rejecting, absent, unavailable parents, whether it's mothers or fathers. It is traumatic and can be traumatic. Obviously, we all have different levels of how we experience trauma, but I mean, it makes sense, right? It's chronically traumatic if you are neglected, if you are a victim of rage or fear or blame or this sort of love-hate or these sort of, intense relational disturbances that the child is often a part of. And so all the studies showed a strong relationship between borderline personality disorder and disorganized attachment. And that's what I was really describing, right? Was that sort of the source of fear was a source of safety. All of this really can't classify behavior. But we also do see BPD in other areas in attachment, like anxious and avoidant. But we really see that the most around unresolved, which is like the parents had an unresolved traumatic experience. That's the part of dissociation where the parent was traumatized. And so they can't give an organized attachment experience because they're so disorganized. Or it was a sort of fearful or preoccupied. So that's anxious. Preoccupied is what we say also refer to with anxious. So fearful, unresolved trauma, and anxious all can really lend themselves to an environment that really makes it ripe for a BPD diagnosis to begin to grow and develop. And it says that in each of these types, individuals showed a yearning for intimacy and yet concern for being too dependent or rejected. So that makes sense. What we really want is to be seen and be felt. And so we want that. But if you have a childhood like this, you often don't really trust that can happen. And so you're more inclined to have fears of being too dependent because being dependent wasn't really safe, or being rejected because when you tried to get your needs met, you were rejected. At least you were probably consistently rejected off and on. You might have gotten some needs met, but oftentimes there was no ability to trust and lean in that I know this parent has my back. I know that I'm safe. So what I hope this does is help explain a little bit more about where BPD can come from in terms of the environmental contributions. Now, as I said in the beginning, I think it's hard because on the one hand, I do think someone had posted something saying, you guys don't really talk about how hard it is to have BPD. And I think that's so fair. I think where we walk the line is that it's hard to have it and it's harder to experience it as a child because you have no one to say, hey, you should end that relationship. You should get out of that relationship. If you're dating somebody or you have a marriage with somebody with this disorder and you decide that you can't do it anymore, you are free to leave. But a child is not free to leave. And so I think that's why I think we have to sort of come at this from both sides. That I don't want anyone to feel that I don't have compassion for having this disorder because having a childhood like this, it sounds like hell, right? It's hellish. And so it's hellish if you are on the receiving end. It's got to be hellish if you have this disorder, and especially if you have awareness around, and I think many people obviously do. They don't feel good about what they do, but they have a hard time controlling it. And that goes back to this whole debate about, well, can you really control it? It is hard when you've had brain development and experiences that really wire you to react and respond in certain ways in the world. That is why treatment is so important. It's important to note that there are varying degrees of borderline PD. And so we have this spectrum of behaviors where it can be on the one end a cluster of symptoms that are sort of not, completely intense, and then all the way up to these very intense and severe in the video I posted before last time, which really shows what it looks like when it is untreated, when a child experiences it, and there's really no way out. It is catastrophically difficult. And if you look at the stories people post about abuse and neglect and pain and wound, it's very significant. And so we have to be able to talk about this from all sides of it without trying to hurt people who've experienced it and not validate them, and also try to understand people that have this disorder and how to help them understand what they're doing, how to get treatment and help, and how to get support so that they can hopefully stop this cycle in themselves and in their families. So I hope you found this video helpful. Feel free to post your responses and know that all we can do is gain knowledge and power around these issues, try to find ways to support and heal people we love. Sometimes you need to have a name for something to understand it, to make sense of it, especially, frankly, whether you have this disorder or you've been a child or a victim to this disorder. and I say victim is a strong word, but you can imagine what it feels like to be on the receiving end. And so it is complicated. It's not simple. Mental health is not a simple in a box type of concept. I find that we really do exist in the gray areas. All of these disorders do. I don't even like to label people because frankly, I don't take insurance. And so I don't have to unless I need to give a super bill. I don't think in terms of this person is this disorder and that disorder, but it is important because we need to understand how to cluster treatment. And so that's why we really also need it. We need to understand, how do we approach these things? What are the elements of it? And that is where it's helpful, not in making anyone feel bad, but also in acknowledging and validating our pain and helping people understand it so that they can really make and find the tools they need to heal their lives. So I'm going to post more videos around narcissism and attachment, avoidant personality and attachment. I think it's really fascinating to look at the childhoods and what sets us up, as I'm posting videos with my first mental health lab, which is really just about who am I really, and it's all about attachment in childhood. So I'm going to post a few more videos really around helping us explore attachment in as many ways as I can in terms of just our functioning in attachment, as well as what disorders, because the truth is with BPD and things like this, what we often see in people that have this disorder and in those who've received it is a lot of mental health issues, a lot of issues around anxiety and depression and PTSD and trauma and complex trauma. And so I think we have to start with understanding ourselves with, where did I come from? How did all this begin? What do I want to do about it? What do I want to change? And how can I lovingly embrace myself and have compassion for what I've been through, my story, and for the story of others. So I'm going to keep going with this series. I'm not yet to part 2 on the mental health labs, but hopefully in the next couple weeks I'll be there. But in the meantime, please feel free to leave your questions and share your stories, and I hope we can all just build a community together in terms of understanding where we all come from, and that we can find some compassion as we do it. All right, guys, take good care. Please don't forget to subscribe if you want to get notified of new videos I post. I love that people are starting to engage with me online, so please do that more. I will also post quick answers to things on Instagram if you have quick questions, and I'll see you next time. So stay safe and well. Okay, bye guys.